Hello, in this lecture I would like to walk you through a good example of a peer-reviewed scholarly research article that deepens our understanding of a literary work, in this case August Wilson's play Fences. We'll look at this article in the context of getting ready to write your own literary research paper. We'll look closely at a particular scholarly research article that offers some impressive research on the real baseball figures mentioned in the play, so that we can see how that information about the real world of baseball helps us to understand Wilson's artistic accomplishment. We'll cover the difference between a good thing that I would be happy that you would do, namely using facts about a real world thing like baseball to help us analyze a work of literature. We'll also talk about a bad thing that I would want you to avoid, namely using details from a work of fiction to support a claim about a thing in the outside world. Not just baseball, but things like the nature of love, or how the grieving process works, or how, things in the real world cause suffering and what real people can do to better their lives. If you played sports in high school, you played by high school rules. And when you got to college, those rules changed. Now, your high school coaches didn't do anything wrong by praising you for playing well by the rules of high school sports. But your college coaches would be doing something wrong if they continued to praise you for playing by high school rules. In a similar way, as your college literature teacher, I'm asking you to play by different rules than the ones that your high school English teachers praised you for following. In high school, your teacher might have praised you for making connections between a story you read and your own real life. Your high school teacher might have asked you how you would rewrite a story to make it more relevant to your peers in the 21st century. Your high school teacher might have asked you to list all the symbols you encountered and sort of speculate about what each symbol could mean. And those are perfectly appropriate things to do in a high school English class. If you think about it, when you did biology in middle school and you dissected a frog, you might have called it an experiment, but it wasn't really an experiment. Does the world really need another sketch of the inside of a frog? I mean, your teacher already knows what the inside of a frog looks like, and everybody who went through middle school already knows, or if they've forgotten for some reason they need to know what it looks like on the inside of a frog, they can just look it up online. Your biology professors, when they, in their day-to-day life, when they're working as biologists, they don't spend all day dissecting frogs, and they don't go to conferences where they show each other their identical labeled drawings of frog anatomy. So in a similar way, if you think of a literature class as the place where you demonstrate you can summarize what you read, and you can list all the example of symbolisms or foreshadowing or irony in a literary work, you're demonstrating that you can sort of cut open a literary work and list its contents. If I needed to know what the color green symbolizes in The Great Gatsby, or what this flower symbolizes in this poem, or what that bird symbolizes, I can just look it up. I can look it up online. These are the lungs, this is how the parts of the digestive system are connected, and this is what the color green represents in The Great Gatsby. But, a biologist doesn't dissect a frog just to prove that they can sketch a frog's insides. A biologist might take 100 frogs and split them into 5 groups and, infect some of them with the disease and leave one group untreated and treat a couple other groups different ways and leave a different group uninfected. And then after a certain amount of time, they might dissect several frogs from each group, not just to prove that they can dissect frogs, but to look for differences between those frogs. I mean, the goal of dissection is not just to produce an accurate sketch that shows what everybody already expects the inside of a frog is supposed to look like. Scientists open up a lot of frogs before they get really surprised by finding something that they did not expect. They look for ways that the inside of this frog differs from what they expected to find. Okay, my metaphor is imperfect because, literary scholars don't, infect poems with diseases or and expose them to radiation and measure the results. Literary scholarship is not about conducting experiments on literature. But my immediate goal here is to point out the difference between the kind of research where your teacher knows the correct answer already and knows that correct answer is out there somewhere waiting for you to find it, like, the diameter of the planet Mars, or how a cell divides, or how you calculate the volume of a sphere, or what a frog looks like on the inside. That's a kind of research, but it's one where the right answer already exists and your teacher wants you to find it. Thinking of research, however, as Googling for the page where somebody has already written down the right answer, that won't help you to do college-level literary analysis, which is not about memorizing correct answers, but it's about learning a skill, such as literary close reading, and demonstrating that you can apply it to a passage in a literary work that your professor maybe never even mentioned during class. So you're doing something original with a skill that your teacher taught you. Okay, so let's turn to some literary analysis. In August Wilson's play Fences, the protagonist, Troy, is a former player in the segregated Negro Baseball League. And according to Troy's friend and kind of sidekick Bono, the only professional players who hit more home runs than Troy were Babe Ruth and Josh Gibson. And according to Troy himself, Troy had a phenomenal batting average of .432, but was stuck in the Negro League when a mediocre white player named Selkirk had a paltry .269 batting average and was playing professionally with the Yankees. Troy also says Jackie Robinson was overrated and says Roberto Clemente was underused because of racist coaches. Okay, well, what I just did wasn't literary analysis. I'm just summarizing details from the play. Now, if you know anything about baseball, at least some of those names I mentioned might ring a bell. And if not, you might be able to gather enough from the play itself just to get the idea that Troy and his friend Bono both thought pretty highly of Troy's baseball career. Troy uses baseball metaphors throughout the play. He says when his son Corey confronts him, he says that's a strike. When Troy refers to giving up his dreams of being a superstar and instead he settles for a steady job and a respectable life with Rose, Troy calls that bunting. It's not a showy play like hitting the ball over the fence, and it leaves him feeling stranded on first base. He doesn't get all the way around the base and score, and he refers to his affair as an attempt to steal second. And he's most remembered for the great monologue where he imagines himself in the batter's box and death is the pitcher on the opposing team. And Troy's memorable admirable qualities are his passion and his toughness, his desire to stay in the fight, and his value of the fact that he's got a strong pitch, or he's got a strong swing. He'll swing at any pitch, and he will go down swinging. And that's presented in Troy's monologues as Troy's admirable qualities. Okay, now we move from summarizing the play, which is not literary analysis, to zeroing in on a topic to explore. I'm getting closer to doing literary analysis. But let's take a look at a peer-reviewed article written by a literary scholar. Okay, so who is this guy, David Letzler? I Googled him. He seems to have been on the English faculty at Queens College at the City University of New York. He's trained in the humanities, and he happens to be really good at statistics, and he knows a lot about baseball. So let's look at his title. It follows a pattern that I recommend. It's got a catchy opening, and it's followed by an informative subtitle that it mentions the limited topic of the paper. So in this case, the title opens with a pun. It's a play on words, walk around the fences. Walking in baseball, it's not as valuable as hitting a home run. It's not as dramatic or heroic or traditionally manly as swinging at that pitch and connecting with a satisfying crack and running triumphantly around the bases while the crowd goes wild. But under the right circumstances, A batter who resists the urge to swing at a bad ball and instead ends up drawing a walk can help his team win. And certainly, a walk is better than striking out. All right, any scholarly work will start with a brief example or an explanation of the status quo. In these first couple paragraphs, Letzler is telling us that scholars who study fences typically accept without question Troy's claim that the segregated Negro Baseball League had 100 players who were better than Jackie Robinson. And scholars also seem to accept Troy's implicit claim that he himself played better than Jackie Robinson, along with Troy's other claims about his baseball skill. Well, even if you didn't already know that Jackie Robinson was the first black player signed by a professional baseball team, which was at the time an all-white team, audiences can pick up from the dialogue in the play. Wilson is very good at giving us, within the script, just enough details about the time period in which his plays are set, that we don't need historical footnotes. We don't need to know a whole lot about Jackie Robinson for us to understand that Troy sees himself on par with this great baseball player. Now, Seltzer's starting point is that literary scholars often take Troy's claims too literally. And Seltzer, he's not just complaining in general, he's naming names and giving specific examples of scholars who hold this position that he's critical of. And he carefully explains what evidence he's found that works against the idea that working against the idea that it's appropriate to trust Troy's opinions of himself. What Seltzer does not do is start at the beginning of the play and list all the baseball metaphors that Troy uses so that he can talk about each metaphor and conclude, therefore, in Fences we see Wilson uses baseball metaphors. Anyone who reads the play can see for themselves that the content of the play includes baseball metaphors. So you're not proving anything by saying there are baseball metaphors in this book. That's like proving you can open up a frog and identify exactly what everybody else expects to find inside a frog. Now, Letzler's point is that his own research into baseball supports the hints that Wilson provides that Troy has an inflated opinion of his baseball talent. Consequently, Letzler disagrees with scholars who accept at face value Troy's statement that racism is the reason why Troy couldn't succeed as a baseball player. I'm not suggesting that racism doesn't exist in this play. I'm not suggesting that racism didn't exist in baseball and that it doesn't exist today. But according to Letzler, an examination of baseball history reveals that almost everything Troy says about baseball is wrong. And this is surprising. This is something worth writing about because it gives us a new way to understand Troy's character, a way that wouldn't be obvious if we accepted as fact Troy's opinion of his own worth. Now, I won't try to reproduce all of Letzler's argument, but I will say I was impressed with his command of statistics. And it's a testament to Wilson's storytelling genius that such a deep investigation into baseball history reveals how consistently Wilson set up a difference between what the fictional character Troy says about baseball and what Wilson expected sports fans would know about baseball and what Letzler found when he looked up these details. So having said that, you don't need to be a sports fan with, minute knowledge of the sport to get the main message about Troy. But Wilson, very early on, depicts Troy as a master storyteller who doesn't let a little inconvenient thing like facts get in the way of telling a good story. On pages 16 through 18 of this script, Troy is telling Lyons a story about paying too much money for his furniture, and he dramatically likens the seller of the furniture to the devil. And twice, Rose says Troy's lying. She says that it's not the devil, and even Bono seems to be challenging Troy on some points. And ultimately, Lyons rejects this story. And Letzler points out that this scene prepares us to accept the idea that Troy is similarly telling a tall tale about his own baseball skills. Now, I have to make it very clear, there is no real Troy whose baseball statistics we can look up. And even if there were a Troy Maxson baseball player, our task in this class would not be to correct the fictional Troy's mistakes, but rather we're studying what the discrepancies reveal about Troy's character. That is, how was Wilson using baseball to tell a story? And Letzler is quite brilliant, I think, when he argues that when Troy made the choice to drop out of the world of professional sports, when he decided literally to stop his habit at swinging at physical baseballs, Troy was demonstrating at some level that he knew his strategy of swinging with all his might at every pitch, his ideology that going down swinging is what a real man should do. Letzler is arguing that Troy knew that ideology was flawed. And that's why Troy does everything he can to redirect his son Corey away from sports. Why is this important? Well, at the college level, a paper that begins with the premise that Fences uses baseball as an important metaphor, and then lists all the important baseball metaphors, and finally concludes that the important baseball metaphors are indeed important and baseball-y and metaphorical. Well, a paper like that would be, let's say that's a foul ball, okay? It's like showing you can accurately sketch the insides of a frog, but it doesn't show you can think for yourself. Opening a frog and sketching the insides is not an experiment. Real biologists conduct experiments that might include dissection, and real literary scholars do analyze the content of the works, but they don't just list them. So a college paper that treated all the baseball details in this play as if they were accurate factual statements that could tell us something about baseball in the real world, well, that paper would be a swing and a miss. That would be a strike. My students are often interested in using literary works in which characters grieve in order to prove that they can apply something that they've learned in their psychology class about the grieving process. Or they might take literary works in which children suffer as an occasion to demonstrate what they've learned about how important it is for children to be cared for in order to thrive. Or they might take a literary work set in a particular time period and use details from that fictional work to prove statements about what it was like in the real world at that time. This story is set in a society that was very sexist. Here's a list of all the sexism that the protagonist faced. From these sexist examples, we can conclude that this sexist society was sexist, or racist, or religiously intolerant, or biased against the lower classes, or whatever. In this lab report, my sketch of the insides of a frog will show that I can sketch the insides of a frog. All these are basic observations about the content of the thing that you're studying. They're designed as if your goal is to summarize the correct answer that everybody will see when they open up the text. Now, I've walked you through a scholarly article that uses facts about baseball in the real world to analyze the representation of baseball in Wilson's fictional work. Note that Letzler is not using the dialogue or actions of any fictional character to support claims about baseball in the real world, or claims about the criminal justice system in the real world, or being a nightclub musician, or being a garbage collector, or how to build fences. Okay? But for practice, now I'm going to raise another question that might be answered with a bit of outside knowledge. That's a question about the literary accomplishment that Wilson is making here. In the world of this play, Corey's service in the military seems to suggest that he did not strike out. Right? when Wilson reintroduces Corey in his military uniform at the end of the play. He does not cover, that is, Wilson does not cover the racism that still pervaded society at the time. It doesn't mention that even though the military was desegregated by a executive order in 1948, certainly there were racist people in the military. Wilson doesn't mention that within a few years of the final scene of this play, the anti-war movement in America would start up, and Corey, along with other Vietnam veterans, would be accused of being baby killers and being accused of being, tools of the military complex. When we see Corey at the end of the play, he seems to be a successful and, apparently a well-adjusted member of the military in society. We can see that through the military, Wilson is offering the idea that black men have another path. It's not as glamorous as being a star athlete, but it's more disciplined than, let's say, being a nightclub musician. It's more, life-altering than being a garbage collector. And it's certainly better than striking out and going to prison. The U.S. military, which had been desegregated for 15 or so years by the time period in which the ending of this play was set, it was an important factor in desegregating other areas of society, as soldiers who had lived and fought alongside each other in integrated barracks returned to civilian life, and they brought along with them their positive experiences. And I don't mean to suggest that the military was free of racism, but a larger number of white men were exposed to working alongside black soldiers for the first time, and many of those white men thought it wasn't that bad, and that paved the way to change society. Okay, so my point is that perhaps there are some clues in this final scene that can lead us to determine just how well is Corey really doing? And I ask you, is it typical for someone who's been in the military for, I think it's 6 years, Corey's been in the military? Is it typical for someone with 6 years of military experience to have the rank that Corey has? Let's consider Gabriel's wartime experience. Wilson is not suggesting that the military is the perfect solution to a black man's problems. Well, what does Wilson have to say about the military? I need more research to be able to answer that question. We cannot use details from this play to support any claims about what it was like to serve in the U.S. military during this time period. But perhaps someone who knows more about the military than I do would be able to use the details that Wilson does provide to draw some additional insight about Corey's character that I, as somebody who doesn't know much about the military, have missed. So, in the words that he put into this play, Wilson gives us all that we really need to know for his play to work, for the tension to build, for the climax to explode, and for the various character arcs to resolve. The play works without doing this outside research. But the fact that in the final scene, Corey and his half-sister Raynell sing a song that they learned from their father, a song that Troy reports his father taught him. It's a song that we never saw Troy singing with his own children. But the fact that we see two of his children singing it together suggests that this youngest generation has at least in some way come to terms with their father's legacy, that some part of Troy's spirit is affecting his children in a positive way. Remember, Letzler concludes that Troy is often wrong about baseball, and understanding the difference between what the fictional Troy says about baseball and what statistical and historical evidence can teach us about baseball. That's an important way to understand the artistic point that Wilson is making in his literary work. He's not, using... We can't learn about baseball from this play, but we can use baseball to understand how Wilson is telling his story. For all the errors that Troy makes in his life, the play seems to support Troy's decision to walk away from the world of professional sports. My point is not to say that Letzler's take on fences is the only correct interpretation, but it's a well thought out analysis. Letzler, is looking at lines that Wilson wrote in the play. His argument connects with, and it differentiates itself from ideas published by other scholars who study fences. And Letzler's argument is not just what he thinks, wishes, hopes, or believes fervently. It's supported by statistics and other facts from the history of baseball. And the fact that it is not Troy's love of baseball or his go-down swinging philosophy that survives into the next generation. Instead, it's this song of Troy's father that survives. That fact is perfectly consistent with everything that Letzler concluded in his article about how Wilson uses Troy's unreliable statements about baseball to tell a story about a man who believes that to be a man he must go down swinging. And the story also covers the damage that his struggle causes among his family members. And I think that if we hadn't looked at, certainly speak for myself, if I hadn't looked at what Letzler said about baseball, I would have thought this play was much more positive about baseball than Letzler seems to think it is. Okay, so I'm hoping that, again, while Letzler is not the only view on fences, I'm not saying that Letzler is the only correct way to interpret fences, but I'm presenting Letzler's article as a good scholarly literary analysis of a play that goes far beyond simply opening up the play and listing its contents. Okay, so for the English department at Seton Hill University, I'm Dennis Jers. Enjoy your reading.